Hey, Soul Stories fam. We're about to begin a brand new love journey. Comment where you're watching from so we can see that our Soul Stories family is all around the world. Las Vegas, the city of lights, where dreamers and risk takers flock with hopes of changing their lives. On that dazzling boulevard, no one failed to know the name Christopher Cole. He was the embodiment of power and luck. From a penniless young man, Christopher transformed barren land into lavish casinos where people spent money as if it were paper. The press called him the King of Las Vegas, the man who turned sand into gold. Financial magazines put him on their covers, praising his sharp instincts. Whenever he appeared in one of his casinos, dozens of cameras flashed nonstop. At parties, Christopher often stood beside Sylvia, his beautiful, elegant wife, born into an old aristocratic family. At his side, too, was Michael, his best friend, his seamless partner in billion-dollar deals. To the world, they were the perfect picture: power, money, fame, and love. Christopher once thought himself invincible, but he had no idea that behind the neon lights, betrayal had quietly taken root. One evening in the high-rise office of Cole Empire, Christopher received a financial report. The blood-red numbers danced before his eyes. The strategic investment fund had been siphoned of hundreds of millions of dollars. Disbelieving, he flipped through the pages, called the chief accountant, and in the end, every thread led back to Michael, the friend who had once started from nothing with him, who had shared a loaf of bread in their poorest days. And worse, Sylvia, the wife who had once shared his bed, had signed the documents, helping Michael legitimize everything. Christopher slammed the file onto the desk, his voice hoarse. "How could you do this to me?" Sylvia lifted her head, her gaze icy, her red lips curling. "Christopher, you're too naive. I didn't marry you for love. I wanted money, status. Now that you've lost it all, why would I stay?" With one sentence, his entire world collapsed. A few weeks later, Sylvia filed for divorce. By law, half of his fortune fell into her hands. Michael disappeared from the city, taking what remained of the fun. On the day Sylvia left the mansion, her white dress billowing, a luxury car waiting at the gate, Christopher just stood at the window watching. His eyes burned red, but not a single tear fell. While struggling to salvage his dignity, Christopher still threw himself into meetings. But every door slammed shut. Investors turned their backs, and the press mocked him relentlessly. The fallen king, from genius to failure. Las Vegas' throne left vacant. One night after yet another failed meeting, he drove alone down the highway. The alcohol coursed through him, his heart blazing. He pressed the accelerator, the engine roaring, tires screeching, and then headlights flared in the opposite lane. A violent crash, twisted steel, shattered glass, his body hurled like a rag doll. When he opened his eyes, he saw blinding white light and heard the doctor's voice. "We did everything we could, but the spinal injury is too severe. From the waist down, you'll never walk again." The words struck like a death sentence. Once a man who strode proudly down red carpets, he was now imprisoned in a wheelchair. The grand Sunset Hill mansion still stood tall, but to Christopher, it was no different from a living tomb. The parties vanished. Golden corridors now echoed only with the clatter of wheels. One by one, the servants quit, unwilling to serve a fallen master. Each day, Christopher sat for hours by the window, staring down at the bright lights of Las Vegas. The city still sparkled, the casinos still thrived, but he knew he had been erased. He drank endlessly. Every night, empty bottles rolled at his feet. His eyes were bloodshot, his beard unkempt. The press still showed no mercy. From king to cripple, the tragedy of Christopher Cole. The man once revered by the whole city is now just a shadow. Each headline cut into his pride like a knife. Worse still, even the smallest tasks, changing clothes, bathing, even using the bathroom, required someone's help. To him, it wasn't just an inconvenience, but humiliation. A man who once ruled the world could no longer command his own body. That night, the city outside still blazed with light, but in the marble-tiled bathroom, the dim lamp seemed to herald the end. Christopher wheeled himself to the bathtub. His trembling hands clutched the edge, struggling to lift his lifeless body across. Sweat poured, veins bulged, but at last he let himself fall into the hot water. The splash echoed across the room. Christopher leaned his head back, eyes shut tight. In his mind, Sylvia's voice returned. "You've lost everything. Why would I stay?" His lips quivered. "I have nothing left. No wife, no friend, no honor, no legs. What am I living for?" The steam thickened the room. Christopher drew one deep breath, then slowly let go, letting the water rise over his mouth, his nose. His ears rang, his heart pounded, then seemed to stop. In that moment, the king of Las Vegas chose to end the game. He had no idea that at that very instant, fate was sending someone into the mansion. An ordinary woman who would pull him out of the darkness and who would change his life forever. Her name was Grace Carter, a 28-year-old. She was born in the poor outskirts of Las Vegas, where dusty streets and ambulance sirens were more familiar than birdsong. Since childhood, Grace had worked to support her family, washing dishes in diners, delivering newspapers in the mornings, and later taking housekeeping jobs to pay for her younger brother's education. She wasn't glamorous, but she was gifted with bright brown eyes and a gentle smile. Life had never favored Grace, but she had learned one truth: the poor cannot afford to collapse. When the agency introduced her to work as a maid in the Cole mansion, Grace hesitated. She knew who Christopher Cole was, the name that once dominated headlines. But now people mentioned him only with mockery: the fallen king, the crippled billionaire. Grace didn't care. Work was work. As long as it paid enough for her to send money home to her brother, she would do it. On her first day stepping into the mansion, Grace couldn't help but be stunned. The house was still magnificent. High gilded ceilings, endless hallways, ancient paintings silently watching from the walls. But the air was heavy, suffocating with coldness. Even light itself seemed hesitant to enter through the windows. The old butler whispered, "The master is not the same anymore. Just do your tasks. Don't pry." Grace nodded and began cleaning, washing, and working in total silence as instructed. Yet every so often she would catch a glimpse of Christopher gliding past in his wheelchair. His posture straight, eyes bloodshot, a bottle of liquor swaying in his hand. He looked like a caged lion, fierce yet desperate. That evening, Grace arrived at work earlier than her scheduled shift. She wanted to take the chance to clean the marble bathroom, a place few dared to step into anymore. No one knew that her diligence and curiosity that night would save a life. The bathroom door opened, releasing steam. Grace froze when she saw the wheelchair toppled to the side. The bathtub was full, liquor floating on the surface, and there was Christopher, sinking deeper, his face almost gone beneath the water. "Oh my God!" Grace cried. Without thinking, she rushed forward. Her small hands clutched his rigid, unresponsive arm, pulling with all her might. Water splashed everywhere, his heavy body slipping against the edge of the tub. Gritting her teeth, she gave everything she had and finally dragged him out, both of them collapsing onto the cold tiles. Christopher coughed violently, water and liquor pouring from his mouth. He struggled upright, hair dripping, eyes bloodshot, staring at her with a mixture of fury and humiliation. "What are you doing here?" His voice was hoarse, broken. "Get out!" Still panting, clothes drenched, Grace didn't move. "If I hadn't come in, you'd be dead by now." "So what?" Christopher snarled, his voice cracking with rage. "You think I want to live? I've lost everything. Money, dignity, my wife. And these legs. What am I now if not useless?" The words lashed out like knives, aimed not just at her, but at himself. Never had he felt such shame, being seen at his lowest. Grace was silent for a moment. She could have left. Who would want to face the wrath of a fallen billionaire? But in those bloodshot eyes, she saw more than anger. She saw a bottomless pit of despair. She drew a deep breath and said, calm but firm, "You're still alive, and being alive has never been useless." Christopher froze. He let out a bitter laugh. "Alive? In this crippled body? With a name the whole world ridicules?" Grace looked straight into his eyes. "Alive means you still have a chance to change. I don't know what your past was, and I don't care what the papers say. All I see in front of me is a human being, and a human being is never useless just because he's fallen." Silence stretched. Christopher's breathing was heavy, his broad shoulders trembling. No one had spoken to him like that since the accident. Others looked at him only with pity or contempt. But this maid dared to meet his gaze, unbowed, unafraid. "You don't understand," Christopher whispered, his voice breaking. "You don't know what it's like to lose everything." "You're right, I don't know what it's like to be rich," Grace replied. "But I do know loss. I lost my mother young, lost my childhood working to raise my brother. And I know this. As long as you can breathe, as long as you can open your eyes in the morning, there is still hope." The words were simple, yet sharp enough to pierce the hardened shell Christopher had built around himself. He turned away, unwilling to let her see the redness in his eyes. Grace spoke softly. "You may hate me for intruding, but at least tonight, you're still alive. And I believe one day you'll be grateful for that life." Then she rose, quietly cleaning up the mess. Puddles of water, shattered bottles. The simple act felt strangely calm, as if saving him had been just another part of her housekeeping. Christopher sat motionless on the cold tiles, listening to the sound of cloth wiping the floor. Inside him swelled a strange sensation. Anger, yes, but also a faint lightness. That night after Grace left the room, Christopher remained, staring into nothingness. In his mind, her words echoed, "You're still alive, and being alive has never been useless." A simple statement, yet for the first time in months, it planted something unfamiliar in his heart. Perhaps he hadn't truly lost everything. The next morning, sunlight pierced through the thick curtains, spilling into the vast bedroom. Christopher opened his eyes, his head pounding like a hammer. Memories of the night before came rushing back. The hot water, the suffocating breath, and the small pair of hands that pulled him out of the tub. He clenched his fists. The humiliation tore at his pride. A man who once ruled the city, now rescued by a maid. When Grace carried in a breakfast tray, Christopher wheeled forward, his voice cold. "Listen, Carter, from now on, just do your job. Cleaning, laundry, nothing more. As for my private life, stay out of it." Grace froze for a brief moment, then gave a slight nod. "I understand." She set the tray on the table, bowed her head lightly, and quietly left. No more words. Christopher watched her small frame disappear, unsettled. He wanted to dismiss her, but something in her calm gaze made it impossible. In the days that followed, Grace kept her word. She didn't ask questions, didn't speak beyond her duties, yet somehow her presence seeped into Christopher's life, silent but steady. When he woke, a hot meal was always waiting neatly arranged on the table. The scent of toasted bread and rich coffee replaced the cold, reeking odor of alcohol. He never said thank you, but he never pushed it away either. Each morning the curtains were drawn open, flooding the room with light. At first Christopher scowled at the glare, but slowly he realized he no longer spent entire days in darkness. The stains of spilled liquor vanished from the floor. Every time he dropped a bottle, the next day the tiles gleamed spotless, as if no trace had ever existed. He knew it was Grace's doing, though she never mentioned it. One evening, as he wheeled past the hallway, Christopher stopped. Light spilled from the laundry room. Curiosity tugged at him, and he peered inside. Grace sat at a small table, needle and thread in hand. Before her lay a white shirt, one he had worn at a major press conference, now frayed at the sleeve. Christopher remembered tossing it into the trash. Yet here she was, carefully stitching each seam, eyes focused, lips pressed together. No one had told her to do that. No one paid her for such meticulous work. But she did it anyway, patient and unhurried, as if each stitch were a way to preserve some piece of him. Christopher's chest tightened, a strange feeling he hadn't known in years. Being cared for, not for wealth or fame, but simply because someone chose to. He quietly left, making sure she didn't see him. But that night, for the first time in months, Christopher didn't drink himself to oblivion. The next day, Grace was as silent as always. She didn't ask if the food was good, and she didn't boast about her work. But when Christopher saw the shirt neatly hung in his closet, the tear mended with fresh stitches, he found himself reaching out to touch the fabric. His frozen heart trembled, just slightly. One afternoon, while Christopher was in his study, a sudden surge of back pain struck. He reached for the bottle of painkillers, but it slipped, rolling out of reach. Fury and helplessness boiled over. He slammed his fist against the desk, knocking over a nearby bottle of wine. Crimson liquid spilled across the floor. The door opened. Grace stepped in, stopping at the sight of the chaos. She said nothing, only walked over, picked up the medicine, and placed it in his hand. Then she knelt down to wipe the spreading stain. Christopher turned his face away, snapping, "I told you not to interfere in my private life." Grace looked up, her eyes calm but firm. "I'm not interfering. I'm just cleaning. That's my job." The simple reply left Christopher speechless. He realized no matter how high he built his walls, this woman remained present, quiet as air, unnoticed yet impossible to live without. That night, Christopher sat by the window, gazing at the distant lights of Las Vegas. For the first time in months, his heart held more than darkness. Images of Grace, mending the shirt, wiping the floor, leaving warm meals, replayed over and over in his mind. He didn't understand why, but her quiet patience was slowly dismantling the fortress he had built around himself. In a mansion once filled only with silence and the sound of spilling liquor, there now lingered something small, fragile, but warm. Christopher never said it aloud, but deep within, he knew. This maid had planted in him a seed of hope he dared not name. The Cole mansion was vast, but to Christopher, every day felt like a sentence. Each morning he woke to the dull ache in his back, the sunlight slipping through the curtains, stabbing at his eyes. And so, instead of beginning the day, he reached for the bottle of liquor, letting the burn numb his flesh and dull, if only briefly, the torment inside his soul. Grace moved quietly around the house, cleaning without complaint, but her eyes missed nothing. She saw the liquor that replaced his meals, the pills he left untouched, the wheelchair he slammed against the wall whenever rage overtook him. One afternoon, Grace placed a tray of steaming food before him. "You should eat something. You can't live on alcohol forever?" Christopher sneered, his gaze icy. "I don't need anyone telling me how to live." "This isn't living," Grace replied calmly. "This is only prolonging death." The words cut straight into his pride like a blade. Christopher slammed his hand on the table, making the tray rattle. "Who do you think you are to say that? You're just a maid." Grace didn't back down. Her brown eyes locked on his, steady and unflinching. "Yes, I'm just a maid, but I won't stand by and watch you destroy yourself." Silence fell. Christopher clenched his jaw and turned away. His chest churned with anger, and something else he refused to name. In the days that followed, Grace began urging him to try physical therapy. She set up a frame and cleared space in the living room. "You can't sit like this forever. At least try to work your muscles again." Christopher let out a bitter laugh. "Muscles? What's left for me to train? Don't you get it? I'm paralyzed." "I get it," Grace said evenly. "But paralyzed doesn't mean motionless. You still have your arms. You still have strength. You can choose to give up, or you can choose to fight." Christopher's eyes flared red, his voice rising. "I've lost everything. What's left to fight for?" "For yourself," Grace said firmly. The reply was so simple, yet it left Christopher speechless. He turned his wheelchair abruptly and left, abandoning Grace in the empty room. But that night, he lay awake, her words echoing in his mind. "For yourself." On another day, Grace brought him a bowl of hot soup. He swatted it aside, the bowl nearly toppling. "I'm not a child who needs to be forced to eat." Grace steadied herself, picked it up, and placed it back in front of him. "You're right, you're not a child, but you're acting like a spoiled one, throwing a tantrum at the world." Christopher froze, too furious to speak. No one had ever dared say such a thing to his face. Everyone around him had either flattered him or feared him. Only this maid dared to treat him like a man. Nothing more, nothing less. His fists tightened, then loosened. For the first time, Christopher didn't fight back, didn't lash out. He simply sat there in silence as Grace slipped the spoon into his hand. He tasted it. Warm chicken broth slid down his throat. It had been far too long since he'd eaten a proper meal. That afternoon, Grace once again placed the training frame before him. Christopher eyed it, weary. Aren't you tired of this? I told you I won't train. You can hate me, Grace said, her voice steady but low. But I won't let you waste away in this house. The words struck hard, reverberating against the wall he had built around himself. He opened his mouth to retort, to hurl back something cutting, but no words came. His chest tightened. His eyes locked on Grace. For the first time, Christopher didn't resist. He only sat there silent, feeling his heartbeat thunder in his chest. Grace stepped closer, moving the frame nearer. You don't have to do much. Just try once. Otherwise, you'll never know what you're still capable of. Christopher didn't answer. His hand trembled, but at last he reached forward, gripping the frame. His arm muscles tensed, sweat broke out, and slowly, agonizingly, he lifted the weight of his unresponsive body, just a little. Only seconds passed before he collapsed again, gasping. But in his eyes flickered something new. Not anger, not despair, determination. Grace smiled softly, saying nothing more. She knew. This was the first time Christopher had cracked open a door for hope. That night, Christopher sat in his study. The bottle of liquor was still on the desk, unopened. He picked it up, then slowly set it back down. Grace's words lingered. You can hate me, but I won't let you waste away in this house. For the first time in a long time, Christopher felt maybe he wasn't entirely useless. The Cole mansion was unusually quiet at night. From the hilltop, the dazzling city lights below belonged to another world. The world Christopher once owned but now felt distant from. He sat alone in the living room, his sinewy hands resting on the dusty black piano keys. This piano had once been his pride. In his younger years, before the business world consumed him, Christopher used to play to unwind after tense meetings. But since the accident, he had rarely touched it. His heavy body, his broken spirit. There seemed to be no room left for music. Tonight, a strange impulse pushed him to wheel closer, brushing the dust from the lid. He set his hands on the keys. The first sound was hoarse, clumsy, like a broken breath. He tried the old piece he once loved, Moonlight Sonata. But his trembling fingers, stiff with pain, turned the melody into fragments. After just a few notes, he grimaced, his hand freezing. Pointless, Christopher muttered, reaching to close the lid. At that moment, a gentle voice spoke from behind. That was beautiful. Startled, he turned. Grace stood at the doorway, a cleaning cloth still in her hand. Clearly she had seen him. Christopher's face flushed, shame laced with anger. Were you spying? He snapped. Grace shook her head, her voice calm. I was just passing by. I didn't know you could play. I can't. I failed. Christopher clenched his fist, bitterness flickering in his eyes. Grace stepped closer, setting the cloth on the table. No, you haven't failed. You're only beginning again. And even if it was just a few notes, I still found it beautiful. The simple words left Christopher stunned. How long had it been since anyone had offered him genuine encouragement? Without pity, without mockery. Grace sat on the long bench beside him, keeping a respectful distance. She didn't urge him to continue, nor did she walk away. She simply sat quietly. Christopher glanced at her bright brown eyes, then back at the keys. After a moment's hesitation, he placed his hands on them again. This time the notes rose once more, still halting, still shaky, but no longer alone. Grace tilted her head, listening. She didn't interrupt, didn't comment. She let the music carry the silence. The vast living room, once shrouded in cold stillness, now stirred by a somber melody. Each broken note seemed to echo Christopher's own story. A man once at the peak, now fallen into the depths. His hands trembled, his back ached, but he pressed on. Sweat dotted his brow, and his breath came heavy. He nearly stopped. But catching Grace's steady gaze, he forced himself forward. Finally, the piece came to an end, unfinished yet whole in its own way. Grace smiled, her eyes glimmering. See? You just played through an entire passage. Christopher said nothing. His heart pounded. Not from exertion, but from something else. How long had it been since someone simply sat beside him like this? How long since he'd shared such an ordinary, strangely warm moment? In that silence, he realized, connection doesn't always need confessions or touches. Sometimes it only takes someone who stays, listens, and doesn't leave. Christopher's gaze softened. He no longer saw Grace as just a maid. In that moment, she was the only person in the world patient enough to hear his pain without fear. When the final note faded, Christopher closed the piano lid. "Thank you for sitting here," he said, his voice hoarse as if afraid of his own words. Grace's smile was gentle. "I didn't do much." "It was enough," Christopher murmured, eyes drifting away. Beneath the golden light, in the vast emptiness of the mansion, the two of them sat side by side, no more words needed. And yet in that silence, a tiny crack opened in the cold wall Christopher had built around his heart. A fragile crack, but enough for light to slip through. The night after the unfinished piano piece, the mansion felt a little less cold. Dawn wind slipped through the pine trees on the hill, sneaked in through a half-open window, carrying the smell of damp grass. Christopher woke earlier than usual. He sat in the living room, a thin blanket over his legs, a cup of tea Grace had left for him steaming on the table. For the first time in months, he didn't reach for the bottle. Grace entered with a laundry basket in her arms. Seeing him awake, she paused, then set the basket down and pulled the curtains open, letting morning light flood the room. Dust sparkled in the sunbeams, drifting like fine powder over the piano's surface. "Ginger tea with honey," she said softly. "Good for the stomach and for the mind, too." Christopher gave a small nod. For a while they sat in silence, broken only by the ticking clock. Then he exhaled, his voice hoarse. "Last night, thank you for staying." Grace smiled and took a seat across from him, keeping the quiet distance between them, an unspoken boundary. "I think it's time I told someone," Christopher began, his eyes tracing the shafts of light on the floor. "Just to stop it from crushing me inside." Grace didn't push. She simply folded her hands together, waiting. "They were the two people I trusted most," he said. "Michael, we started from nothing, eating instant noodles in a cheap apartment. Half of this empire was built out of sleepless nights, fighting over interest rates, debating whether we should gamble everything on that ugly lot in Fremont. And Sylvia, I married her because it seemed like the right move for a man like me. A polished marriage, an old family name, the press applauding. I thought I was clever." Christopher gave a bitter laugh. "Until the strategic fund vanished. The accountant handed me records of steady transfers into shell companies. The approving name was Michael. The final authorizing signature was Sylvia's. She helped him make the paperwork look clean. When I confronted Michael, he muttered something about a temporary investment and disappeared from the city. Sylvia signed the divorce papers. No apology, not even a glance." He stopped, drawing a sharp breath. His eyes drifted down to the half of his body that no longer obeyed him. "I could still walk then. I thought I could save the company if I just had the time. But the press smelled blood. Investors ran. I drove back from a meeting where every door had slammed shut. There were screeching brakes, headlights from the other lane. Then a white blur. When I woke up, the doctor told me everything below the waist would never obey me again." The room fell silent. Grace's throat tightened. Christopher braced his elbows on the wheelchair arms, his fingers tapping lightly, as if each word he spoke was a stone pulled from his chest. "The strange thing," he continued quietly, "it wasn't the physical pain that killed me. It was the small things. I couldn't slide off the bed myself. I need someone to help me into the bathroom, calculating if the chair would fit through the door or snag on the rug. Things I never even noticed existed. Every time I needed help, it was like a voice whispering, 'You're useless.' And I believed it. I looked in the mirror and saw a crippled, worthless man. Not a king, not a genius, just a breathing corpse." He bit his lip, his broad shoulders tensing, then sagging. Grace set the basket aside and moved her chair a little closer. Not too close, but close enough for her voice to reach warmer. "I can't tell you not to hurt," she said gently, "but I can tell you this. Useless isn't an identity, it's a feeling, and feelings can change." Christopher lifted his head, meeting her eyes. Grace's gaze carried no pity, only honesty. "You're not the only one who's been called names," she continued, I've heard plenty myself. Just a maid. Poor girl. Never make it past scrubbing floors. She smiled faintly. Not bitter, just a little sad. My mother died when I was 14. My brother Noah and I moved 3 times in a year because we couldn't pay rent. I worked at a diner, washing dishes in the morning and waiting tables at night. A drunk spilled soup on himself and cursed me like I was a walking trash can. I remember wanting to scream that I wasn't useless, but my mom used to say, "You are not what people call you. You are what you do, one day at a time." So I picked up the spoon, cleaned up, and went back the next day. Christopher listened intently. Grace rarely spoke much about herself. Tonight she opened a door. I dropped out of college after 1 semester, she went on. Tuition was too high. I chose to work so Noah could have a chance. He's smarter than me, I always thought so. I saved every dime, and even tips went into a jar. In my spare time, I read old books that people gave me, taught myself to bake, fix wiring, and sew clothes. Not because I loved doing everything, but because I refused to stay just poor. I wanted to rescue myself instead of waiting for someone else to do it. She looked down at her calloused hands, still bearing faint marks from sewing his shirt the day before. Once Noah was teased at school for wearing old shoes. I bought a pair secondhand, scrubbed until my hands blistered, and polished them until midnight. The next day he walked to class with his head higher. That's when I realized sometimes salvation isn't dramatic. It's a hot meal, a mended shirt, a window open for light, small things, but they remind you you're still seen. Her words lingered in the shifting sunbeam on the floor. Christopher tilted his head slightly. The muscles in his jaw eased. "And your brother now?" he asked, for the first time dropping the formal Carter. "He's studying engineering at community college," Grace said, pride softening her tone. "Not a famous school, but it's his dream. I pick up extra shifts to help him buy books. He always says, 'You're my hero.' I laugh and tell him, 'No, I just open windows.'" They both laughed quietly. Not loud, but enough to clear some of the damp heaviness from the air. Christopher rubbed the wheel rim gently. Inside his chest, something shifted. A weight, or perhaps a curse. He wasn't sure, but he knew the feeling of being just a corpse had stepped back, even if only half a pace. "Grace," he said slowly, "I know I've pushed everyone away. I thought if I stayed cold enough, hard enough, no one would see me weak. But it left me alone with that voice saying useless in my head. You're sitting here listening. You've saved me in a way I never expected." Grace shook her head. "I don't want you to owe me anything. I don't want to be anyone's savior. I just think you deserve a chance not to be defined by your fall. The way Noah deserved clean shoes, the way your shirt deserved to be stitched back together." "But what if I never walk again?" Christopher asked the question he had avoided for so long. "What if this is forever?" Grace paused, then answered without trembling. "Then you'll learn to live a good life in this body. Not the life you dreamed of, but still your life, and you have the right to own it." The words were brutally simple. No miracle promised, no impossible dream. But because of that, they became a firm anchor. Christopher leaned back, closing his eyes briefly. When they opened again, his gaze had changed. "Do you ever feel hatred," he asked, "for the people who look down on you?" "Yes," Grace admitted, "but hate never paid the rent, never covered my mom's hospital bills, never put dinner on the table. Work did. Love did. I choose the things worth my time." The air fell still. Outside, a bird welcomed the morning. Christopher lifted the cup and took a sip. The heat of ginger ran down his throat, warming even the places he thought were frozen. "They called me king," he said with a crooked smile. "But maybe I never ruled anything beyond my greed and fear. Michael needed only a signature, Sylvia only a shrug. And I crumbled. You've had a life without favor, yet you're still standing." Grace shook her head. "I've fallen plenty of times too, but each fall, I try to get up a little faster. Tomorrow's fall will be smaller than yesterday's. That's all." A warm hush settled. Christopher turned his chair toward the window. Sunlight now poured in fully, lighting the wooden floor golden like honey. "Tomorrow," he said, Could you stay 15 minutes longer after breakfast? For what? Grace tilted her head. To sit with me while I work my arms again. And maybe try that piece, the Moonlight Sonata. No promises, but I want to try, like you said. Grace smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. Deal, but before the piano, you finish your oatmeal. No compromise. Christopher laughed for real, short, rough, but a laugh. He nodded. No compromise. She rose, lifted the basket. Before leaving, she paused, pulled a coarse handkerchief from it, and placed it on the piano. For dusting before you play, she said. Better than your sleeve. Thank you, he murmured. After a beat, he added softly, Grace. She turned and walked out. Her footsteps echoed steadily across the marble, like a silent metronome. The door closed gently, leaving Christopher with a half-finished cup of tea and a morning free of alcohol. He looked at the handkerchief on the piano, at the rising sun painting the distant strip towers. Inside his chest, something long and empty began to bloom. Small, but warm. He didn't know the name of it. Empathy, hope, or simply the feeling of not being abandoned in this house? Maybe all of it. And maybe that was enough to begin. At noon, the old butler passed through the living room, noticing the liquor bottle still sealed. He glanced up and saw Christopher at the piano, his hand resting on the coarse cloth. The old man's eyes softened. He said nothing, only opened another window. Light rushed in, stronger, brighter, as if two people had just found each other amid the ruins. One once called crippled and useless, the other once called poor and worthless. And yet they still possessed the most precious gift, the ability to sit, listen, and call each other by name, not by the labels the world had thrown on them. And from that moment, the wall around Christopher was no longer stone. It had cracked, and where there is a crack, light will always find a way in. Soul Stories fam, if you're watching on another channel, come home to us at Soul Stories, where tens of thousands are listening and sharing together. That morning, sunlight stretched across the tall glass windows. Grace opened them wide, letting the cool breeze sweep in, carrying the scent of jasmine from the garden. The mansion, once as silent as a tomb, now felt faintly alive. Christopher sat in his wheelchair, quietly watching. Outwardly, he still wore his cold mask, but deep in his eyes, Grace sensed something else, a hidden anticipation. After a long night of restlessness, he hadn't reached for liquor. Instead, his gaze lingered on the steel training frame in the corner, as if it were an adversary waiting to be faced. Grace stepped closer, her voice soft. Are you ready? Christopher smirked. Ready to fall? If you fall, I'll help you back up, Grace replied, calm and steady. But if you never try, you'll never know what you can still do. He gave a dry laugh, then set his hands on the bars. The first attempts were brutal. His arm muscles swelled, veins standing out, shoulders trembling. His legs hung heavy as stone, refusing to lift even a fraction. Christopher clenched his teeth, sweat dripping down, until finally he let go and slumped back into the chair. Breathless, furious, he slammed his hand against the frame. See? I told you it's useless! Grace silently wiped the sweat from his forehead, then crouched down so her eyes met his. Christopher, remember what I told you about my brother? He once fell off his bike and broke his arm. The doctor said it would take months to heal. Every day he tried lifting it, crying from the pain. But my mother told him, every time you lift it, even a little, you're winning against your fear. She paused, her voice gentle but unwavering. It's the same for you. Every second you dare to try, you defeat that voice in your head, calling you useless. Christopher stared at her. Silence stretched. Then he drew a deep breath and gripped the bars again. The second time, he pushed harder. His hands shook until his knuckles turned white. His upper body strained upward. And then, his legs twitched, just slightly like a reflex. But Grace saw it. Did you see that? She cried, her eyes bright with joy. Your legs just moved. Christopher froze. His heart raced. He tried again. His whole body tensed, sweat dripping to the floor. Slowly, shakily. But this time, he stood. Only for a few seconds. But unmistakably, he stood. Grace gasped, covering her mouth, then burst out laughing with childlike delight. "You did it, Christopher! You really did it!" Christopher felt his legs like dead weight, his back aching, yet his chest tightened with something overwhelming. "I still can." His vision blurred. He turned his head away quickly, but a hot tear slipped down his cheek. Grace touched his arm gently, whispering, "Men are allowed to cry, Christopher. You just won the greatest battle of your life." He collapsed back into the chair, gasping. His body was drained, but his chest blazed with light. He looked at his trembling hands, remembering Grace's words from the night before. "You can choose to give up, or you can choose to fight." And now he had chosen to fight. I really stood up, didn't I?" His voice was husky. "Yes," Grace nodded, her smile radiant. "And next time, you'll stand longer." Christopher let out a laugh, tangled with tears. In that moment, he no longer saw himself as a crippled failure. He was a man who had just taken the first steps back. By evening, the golden light spilled across the tiled floor. Christopher sat by the window, a cup of tea in his hand. In front of him, Grace busied herself with chores, her face still glowing with joy from their training. He watched her, then spoke softly. "Grace, thank you. Without you, I wouldn't still be here to try again." Grace turned, her gentle smile enough to answer. No more words were needed. In the silence, both of them knew. Today wasn't just the first time Christopher stood with his body. It was the first time he stood with his head held high. A single ray of light, small, fragile, but strong enough to tear through the darkness that had consumed him for so long. Las Vegas at night glittered like an endless party. Neon lights from the streets below reflected into the sky, turning the darkness into a shimmering dome of illusion. But inside the Cole mansion, silence reigned, broken only by the steady tick of a clock and the occasional rustle of wind through the garden trees. Christopher sat on the balcony of the second floor, leaning forward with a thin blanket draped over his shoulders. Sleep wouldn't come. The past days of training had left him both exhausted and strangely awakened. For the first time in years, life didn't feel like a dark tunnel. Somewhere inside, he had glimpsed a faint light. But with that light came fear. If it went out, would he tumble back into the abyss? The door creaked open. Grace stepped out, holding 2 cups of steaming ginger tea. "I guess you weren't asleep," she said with a gentle smile, setting one in front of him. Christopher looked up. In the glow spilling from the room behind her, her face was soft, luminous. He nodded, his voice low. "I'm not used to the silence. Before, every night was music, laughter, and clinking glasses. Now, there's only the sound of my own heart." "Sometimes that's exactly what we need," Grace replied, settling into the chair beside him. She cradled her cup, blowing gently on the steam. "Because only when we can hear our own heart do we know what we truly want." Christopher stayed quiet, gazing at the distant city. After a long pause, he turned toward her. The look in his eyes made Grace falter for a second. In the dark, it carried more weight than words. Almost without thinking, he reached out. His large, veined hand trembled as it closed over her smaller one, which rested on the arm of the chair. Warmth spread through his skin, making his heart stutter. "Grace," he whispered, voice rough, "what do you see when you look at me?" Grace froze. In his question, she heard not just curiosity, but the deepest fear, the fear of being seen only as crippled, useless, or a fallen king, with nothing left but memories. She squeezed his hand gently, lifting her chin, her brown eyes glowing. "I see a man who still has a heart." 4 simple words, piercing straight through the icy shell Christopher wore. He opened his mouth to speak, but choked back the words. His whole body shook, not from the night air, but from the raw truth. For the first time, someone wasn't looking at his wheelchair, or his lost glory, or the mocking headlines. This woman saw him, a man with a heart still beating, still worth something. Grace lowered her head briefly, shy. But when she looked up, she met Christopher's gaze. His eyes no longer held anger or bitterness, only something fragile, vulnerable, and achingly real. The space between them seemed to close. Christopher leaned in slowly. The kiss came suddenly, soft as a passing breeze. His lips brushed hers, trembling, hesitant, yet filled with all the emotions he had locked away for months. Grace closed her eyes. Her heart pounded, not from surprise, but from the sincerity of the moment. This wasn't the kiss of a once powerful billionaire, nor of a desperate man clinging to hope. It was the kiss of someone rediscovering himself and finding the one person who could reach the deepest part of his soul. When they pulled apart, Christopher still clutched her hand tightly. His lips trembled, and in his eyes shone a light he had never shown before. "Thank you for seeing me." Grace's cheeks flushed pink in the golden glow. She smiled softly. "You don't need to thank me. I only said what I saw." They sat together, gazing at the city below, and in that silence both knew one truth. From this moment on, they were no longer two lonely souls trapped in a house of ghosts. Amid the whispers of the night, they had found each other. The first days of Christopher's training brought rare rays of hope to the mansion, once shrouded in gloom. Grace kept up her steady rhythm of cleaning, preparing hot meals, and sometimes sitting beside the piano to listen as he worked through pieces. Together they built a quiet routine, simple but strangely warming. But peace never lasts. News about Christopher Cole, the once king of Las Vegas, had never fully disappeared from the headlines. The media thrived on tales of downfall, and Christopher's name was the perfect bait for endless clickbait titles. When rumors spread that a poor maid had appeared in his mansion, the press pounced. Disgraced billionaire Cole now clings to a maid for company? The fallen king reduced to needing a low-class woman to care for him? Venomous words filled tabloids and spilled across social media. Christopher was mocked relentlessly, and Grace, who had never asked to be dragged into the scandal, was now under fire as well. Adding fuel to the fire was Sylvia. Christopher's ex-wife knew he was still living in the mansion, and his having a young maid was the perfect chance to smear him further. In a tabloid interview, Sylvia smiled with cruel amusement. Christopher has always surrounded himself with people who only saw his money. I'm not surprised he's found comfort in a poor girl who's obedient and desperate for cash. Her words cut like knives. Soon the public branded Grace with a merciless label, a gold digger. Grace heard it all. At the market, whispers trailed behind her. "That's her!" The maid clinging to Cole. "Poor girl must be clever. Now she's living in the Golden Palace." She pulled her hat lower, gripping the bag straps tighter. She'd been looked down on before, but this was different. She didn't want Christopher dragged into more humiliation because of her. Grace chose silence. She still cooked, still cleaned, still smiled when helping Christopher into his training sessions. But whenever she could, she avoided the outside world. She dreaded the pitying or scornful stares that might touch him. In front of Christopher, she never cried. But at night, alone in the dark kitchen, Grace would sit down, clutch the old handkerchief, and wipe away the tears she couldn't hold back. Christopher was no fool. He knew exactly what was happening. Tabloids delivered their poison straight to his inbox. He couldn't ignore the headlines dripping with mockery. He read them, his chest tightening. He noticed Grace growing quieter, speaking less, sometimes avoiding his eyes. She never told him about the whispers, but he could feel it. He knew she was being hurt, and all because of him. But what could he do? His fortune was all but gone. The power that once made men tremble had crumbled. Friends had turned away. He had no press to defend him, no lawyers to silence the lies. And now, realizing that Grace was paying the price for staying by his side, Christopher faced his cruelest truth: helplessness. One sleepless night, Christopher wheeled himself out in search of water. A faint light glowed from the kitchen. He stopped at the doorway. Grace stood by the table, clutching the coarse handkerchief, her shoulders trembling. Tears streamed down her face, glistening under the dim light. She wiped them quickly, straightened, breathing deep, as if to erase all evidence before stepping outside. Christopher clenched his fist so hard his nails dug into his palms. Rage surged through him. Rage at the vultures outside, at Sylvia, but most of all, at himself. He had let Grace, the only soul who shielded him at his weakest, be shamed in his place. He wanted to rush forward, hold her, promise protection, but harsh reason hissed, with what? With this wheelchair? With an empire in ruins? What can you protect? So he stood in silence, chest aching, hidden in the dark. When Grace turned, her eyes were dry, her smile forced. You're still awake? Christopher swallowed hard, nodding, forcing his voice steady. I needed water. She poured him a glass and handed it to him. Neither spoke of the tears, but in that moment, Christopher made a decision. Back in his room, he sat long at the window. Below, the city blazed on, loud and mocking, as if jeering at his helplessness. He pressed his palm to his chest and whispered to himself, I must rise again. Not just to reclaim honor, but to protect her, the one who sheltered my soul when I was at my weakest. That vow burned in his heart, stronger than any fear or shame. From that night on, Christopher knew his resurrection was no longer about himself. It carried a greater meaning, one that was deeper and heavier. Grace was the reason. That day, the Cole mansion seemed cloaked in a different kind of air. Gone was the suffocating silence that had haunted its halls for months. In its place came the rustle of turning papers, the scratch of a pen, the faint grind of wheelchair wheels across polished wood. In the study, a room that had stood abandoned for so long, the lights now blazed bright through the night. Christopher sat behind the old oak desk, a towering stack of documents spread out before him. Market reports, financial bulletins, stock charts. His hands, once so accustomed to clutching bottles of liquor or painkillers, now moved restlessly across the pages, underlining, annotating, calculating. Each number, each headline reawakened something buried inside him. The sharp instinct of a businessman, the instinct that betrayal, despair, and tragedy had once nearly destroyed. He was no longer the arrogant king of Las Vegas who had ruled from the top of glittering towers, but in his eyes burned the unmistakable light of a man ready to be reborn. Grace noticed the change immediately. Every morning when she entered, instead of finding him motionless by the window, she would find Christopher bent over the desk. Instead of empty bottles, there were only black coffee and scattered pens. You stayed up again, didn't you? Grace asked, worry flickering in her voice. Christopher looked up, the corner of his mouth tilting into a smile. I didn't sleep, but this time, it wasn't because of nightmares. He never told her exactly what he was working on, but Grace could see it in the set of his shoulders, the intensity in his gaze, the way his hands never stilled. Once, when she gently tried to caution him not to push himself too hard, Christopher simply answered quietly but firmly, I have to prepare. This time I cannot afford to fail. At night, while Las Vegas glowed with its neon fever, Christopher pored over reports of companies on the edge of collapse. A hotel on the Strip is running out of cash, a restaurant chain drowning in red ink, a neglected lot on the fringes of Fremont. He wrote everything down and marked every lead. He had lost an empire because he had trusted the wrong man, because he had given control to others. Never again. This time, Christopher would build brick by brick, with his own hands, quietly, carefully, until the foundation was unshakable. Grace didn't need to know every detail, but she felt the transformation nonetheless. She set down hot meals at his desk without a word. She quietly swapped out painkillers for warm milk, and when she saw his shoulders slump from exhaustion, she didn't lecture. She simply placed a hand on his shoulder and said softly, You don't have to prove yourself to the whole world. It's enough that you know you can protect what you love. To Christopher, those words were worth more than any headline, more than any applause he had ever received. One late afternoon, Christopher asked Grace to take him out to the back garden. The grounds had once been overgrown and neglected, but Grace had tended them patiently until lavender and white roses bloomed in the sun. Today, I want to try something, Christopher said, his gaze fixed on the stone path stretching down the garden. Grace froze. That path is long. Are you sure? I have to do it. His eyes burned with resolve. He gripped the mobile walking frame Grace had prepared. The first steps were torturous, slow, trembling, as if his legs were weighted with stone. Sweat trickled down his temples, and his shirt clung damp against his back. But he didn't stop. With every step, his breath came harsher, his face drawn in strain. His vision blurred, but it wasn't despair that clouded his eyes now. It was sheer determination. Grace hovered close, her voice steady but urgent. Slowly. That's it. One more step. The stone path seemed endless. Again and again, his knees buckled, his muscles quivered like they might give out. But Christopher clenched his teeth, refusing to surrender. One step, another, again and again, until at last. He pressed his trembling hand against the rough bark of the oak tree at the very end of the path. The finish line he had set his sights on from the start. He was standing, barely, shaking, gasping, drenched in sweat. But he was standing. Grace burst into tears, rushing forward to wrap her arms around him. Her voice cracked against his shoulder. You did it, Christopher. You really did it. Christopher tightened his hold on her, his heartbeat hammering wildly. He bent down, whispering through ragged breath, but with unshakable conviction. I will come back. For you. In that moment, the Las Vegas sky burned a golden hue with the setting sun, enveloping the two figures in radiant light. One man who had once collapsed before the eyes of the world. One woman who had once been dismissed as nothing more than a maid. Together, they now witnessed the greatest turning point of his life. Christopher was no longer just the broken man in a wheelchair, watching the world move on without him. He had walked, and more importantly, he had found the reason to keep walking. From that moment, the true rebirth of Christopher Cole had begun. After months of perseverance, Christopher's unsteady steps had become the clearest proof of change. He no longer depended entirely on the wheelchair. Each step was still slow, still heavy, but every time he rose, it was a declaration. I am back. Not only his body, but also his mind and willpower had reawakened. From small ventures, a failing restaurant, a neglected plot of land, he quietly bought them through shell companies. The profits weren't much, but every line of black ink on a report was a quiet triumph. Step by step, he began moving into larger deals. Whispers spread through the business world. Cole isn't dead after all. On the night of the gala, Las Vegas itself seemed brighter. It was the annual financial banquet, where the city's most powerful figures gathered. Once, Christopher had entered this hall as its star, the king himself. Tonight he returned, his stride imperfect but his eyes ablaze. Grace walked beside him. She wore a simple navy blue dress, elegant in its restraint, her hair swept up, her face soft yet confident. Christopher's grip tightened around her hand as they entered the grand ballroom. Dozens of eyes turned, sharp with curiosity, some glittering with mockery. Whispers hissed like knives. Is that the maid the tabloids talked about? Cole really has fallen, hasn't he? Even his date is low class. Every word reached Christopher's ears. He only smirked, lips curling in disdain. When the evening reached its height, Sylvia appeared. She was as dazzling as ever, her crimson gown blazing like a flag of triumph. At her side was a young, smug-looking businessman. Sylvia strode directly to Christopher, her voice dripping honey over steel. Christopher, I never thought you'd dare show your face here again. You really are brave. Or foolish. Her gaze flicked to Grace, her smile twisting. And this must be your new comfort? She looks far more obedient than the women you used to keep at your side. A few snickers rippled through those nearby. Grace stiffened, her face hot, but she held her silence. Christopher looked at Sylvia for only a moment, then suddenly turned to Grace. In that instant, the ballroom lights seemed to blur, leaving only her in his sight. He held her hand tighter, his voice rough but ringing with strength. Sylvia, you're right about one thing. I'm not the king people once cheered for. I fell. I lost everything. The room hushed. Christopher's voice deepened, burning like fire. But you're wrong about something far greater. When the whole world turned its back, she, the woman you mock right now, stayed. She pulled me back when I wanted to die. She made me stand when I didn't believe in myself. Then before the astonished crowd, Christopher bent to one knee. The movement was halting, pained, but filled with pride. From his pocket, he drew a small velvet box. He opened it, his voice shaking but resolute, echoing through the hall. The world may laugh at me, but I will never regret saying this. Grace Carter, will you marry me? Grace froze. In the blaze of lights, under hundreds of watching eyes, she saw not the broken man, not the fallen king, but the man who had once lost everything and now knelt before her with unshakable sincerity. Tears slipped down her cheeks, not of shame, but of overflowing joy. She nodded again and again, voice breaking. Yes, yes, I will. Thunderous applause erupted, mingled with the frantic flash of cameras. But in that moment, Christopher and Grace saw only each other. He rose, staggering but firm, and kissed her deeply in the center of the ballroom. Sylvia stood frozen, her face drained of color, her triumphant smile shattering in pieces. The next morning, the press exploded. Fallen billionaire finds his crown in the hands of a maid. Christopher Cole, from ruin to a proposal that shook the city. Everywhere the photos spread. Christopher kneeling unsteadily, clasping Grace's hand, their kiss in the blaze of flashing lights. If once the world had mocked Grace as a gold digger, now the image became undeniable proof. She was the one who had stayed when the world abandoned him. That night back at the mansion, Christopher held Grace's hand tight. His voice was hoarse, but thick with emotion. I promised I'd stand up again for you. Today I did. But this is only the beginning. Grace rested her head against his shoulder, smiling through tears. For me today was already the greatest victory. And in the darkness, the mansion that had once felt like a tomb now breathed with life, with a new beginning. Christopher Cole, the man who had once collapsed, had truly risen again. Not only for honor, but for love. 2 years had passed since the night Christopher knelt under flashing cameras and proposed to Grace before the eyes of the world. 2 years, enough time for everything to change, not only in glittering Las Vegas, but in his very life. From small ventures, Christopher had rebuilt piece by piece. Today, the name Cole Group once again appeared proudly in financial headlines. But unlike before, this empire was no longer a Cole dynasty built on arrogance. It was built on patience, trust, and above all, love. And the clearest proof of that change was right there in the Cole mansion, once dark and lifeless, now ringing with children's laughter. In the living room, a little boy of 18 months wobbled across the carpet, his tiny legs stumbling. Each time he fell, he giggled and held out his arms for his father. Beside him, his twin sister sat in a walker, babbling happily. Ma, da. Grace laughed, swooping down to kiss her daughter's chubby cheeks. You said mama. My sweet girl. Christopher stood nearby, his eyes alight with happiness. He still walked with a slight limp, but strong enough now to lift his son high above his head and spin him in a circle. The boy's laughter filled the room with sunshine. Grace watched them, her heart swelling with gratitude. This house, once a living tomb, the place where Christopher had nearly surrendered his life, was now alive with warmth, light, and children's joy. The change was not only in family life. In business, Christopher had returned to the top, stronger than before. He no longer chased empty games of power, but chose a steadier path, rebuilding struggling hotels, reviving small restaurant chains, and creating jobs for thousands. At his side stood Ethan, Grace's younger brother. Once a shy young man, Ethan had grown into a promising executive, managing a major division of the company. To Christopher, he wasn't just a right-hand man, but the brother life had given back to him. The wedding of Christopher and Grace was a simple affair, held in the garden behind the mansion. No blinding flashes, no thousands of strangers in suits, only family and close friends, the ones who had witnessed both their heartbreak and their rebirth. Grace wore a pure white dress, carrying a bouquet of lavender. Christopher, in a tailored black suit, walked with a limp but stood tall and proud by her side. Their twins, cradled in the arms of the butler, chirped "Ma, ma," as though providing the soundtrack to the ceremony. When it came time to exchange rings, Christopher looked deep into Grace's eyes. His voice was low but steady. I once thought my crown was wealth and power, but I was wrong. My true crown is you, the woman who saved me, who loved me when I had nothing. Grace's eyes glistened as she replied, and I will always be with you. Not because of who you are, but because you're the man who dared to rise, dared to love, and dared to live again. Their kiss under the Las Vegas sunset wasn't just the end of a wedding ceremony. It was an eternal vow for a new life together. That evening, the small wedding feast gathered around a long table under the open sky. Friends raised glasses in celebration. Ethan told awkward old college stories that made everyone laugh. The twins, tired after a long day, slept soundly in the nanny's arms. Their cheeks flushed pink in the golden glow of lantern light. Christopher sat at the head of the table, Grace beside him. He looked around, the house glowing warm, voices filled with joy, the scent of food drifting in the night. He remembered the nights he had sat alone in the dark, surrounded only by liquor and silence. His chest tightened for a moment, then loosened into a peace he had never known. He reached for Grace's hand, lifting it to kiss the back of it softly. "I once lost everything, but because of you, I've found... No, I've gained more than I ever had." Grace leaned against his shoulder, whispering back, "Because we built this together, Christopher." A family, love, and a new empire. Night fell. Golden light from the dining room spilled through the windows, illuminating the scene of a family gathered close. On the long table, wine glasses glimmered, plates of half-eaten cake still scattered, laughter echoing through the halls. In the nursery, the twins slept peacefully in their cribs, tiny hands curled, breaths even and steady. Grace tucked a blanket around them, kissed their foreheads, then turned back toward Christopher. He stood before the great window, gazing out at the neon glow of Las Vegas. But this time his eyes held no loneliness, only the light of faith. He turned, smiling at his wife, whispering, This is my true crown. You and our children." Grace walked over and wrapped her arms around him from behind. They stood there a long time, listening to laughter ripple through the house. A house that was once filled with shadows, now transformed into a home. This was happiness, the ending and the beginning of a new life. Thank you for being part of Soul Stories. If you're listening on another channel, come back to the official home so you can continue our love journeys together with the Soul Stories family.